Welcome to the first episode of the Max Term Podcast. I'm Kyle Stich alongside James Finch, and tonight we're going to take you through our contract projection model. Couple things before we get started. First, please follow our podcast, Max Term Podcast. It'll be available on all podcast platforms. Follow us on Twitter at MaxTermPod and our business account, AFP Analytics. Before we get started here, just a couple things. Everything we talk about in this podcast is our own opinions. It's not necessarily a reflection of anything we're hearing in the industry. We do have some level of connections in the industry, but we're not going to be passing along information that's been trusted as sensitive material to us. As well as any ads that might be associated with this podcast are not necessarily products we are endorsing or views that we are agreeing with. Let's talk about our contract projection model, which Frank Sarabelli of Daily Faceoff has been using in his articles highlighting the top free agents available, and it's also appeared in The Athletic. So there's lots of questions about how do we actually come up with these projections. Well, we've been refining them for 4 years now, 4 or 5 years if you want. Started off with a little test the waters in 2018, did about 30 names, and then since then we've been building and refining. James and I have been working on these for about 4 years. We'll talk a little bit more about how accurate we've been and everything like that, but first let's talk about how we get to those final numbers, those numbers that you see publicly available, free. Anyone can access them. Anyone who's listening is free to use them as long as you properly cite this. We would appreciate tagging us on Twitter at AFP Analytics or the Max Term Pod. So the projections are based on basically coming to a market value, market basket, if you will, for each player. We have an internal application kind of set up. We give the computer a couple of inputs, look at age ranges, which considers whether they're unrestricted free agents or restricted free agents, as well as kind of where their cap hit percentage is likely going to be. And between all of that, we hit a couple buttons and get an output of list of players. From those players, we're looking at it to see, okay, do all these players make sense with who we're trying to project? So, for example, if we output a defenseman and they're right shot defensemen generally get paid a little bit more on the market. It's more of a premium. As well as if they maybe are a forward that has some center flexibility, we try to lean towards players who are centers as well as for their comparisons. So we kind of go through and fine tune. If we also see someone on this list that is probably not stylistically the correct person, so if have a pure sniper and there's a heavy kind of grinder, works along the boards, we're going to take that guy out of the kind of market basket. Our goal is to come up with a market basket of players that gives kind of a high case scenario, a better case, midpoint, and then a low case scenario, because it's not necessarily true that everyone's going to perform as expected. So we'll talk about a couple of the recent contracts that were signed just to kind of give you a little insight into how we came up with the numbers that we did, some of the players that make sense as comparisons, and then we'll talk a little bit more about kind of how the projections work and how the agents and everything negotiate these in real life. So, James, let's start with, maybe one that looked really well in our projections. Let's start with Damon Severson. Why not?
All right, Damon Severson. We did pretty well with Severson. We projected a cap hit percentage of 7.3, and he ended up signing for 7.49. He did get a max term deal with Columbus in a sign and trade. We only had him for 6 years, but we believe that the extra 2 years is really just a product of the situation he was in. And his agent did really well for him to get those 2 years. As far as comparable players for Damon Severson, when we came up with his projection, so like I had said, we ended up at 6 years, and we had a cap hit percentage 7.3, which worked out, assuming a cap of 83.5 million, about 6.1 AAV for Severson was our projection. How we got to that. So there were some really key players, and like Kyle said, some were a little above, some were about the same, and some were a little under. So I'm going to start at that high end comparable. Mackenzie Weegar has basically been the versatile defenseman that everyone wants in their lineup. So having him as a comp for Severson, not necessarily going to light up the score sheet points wise, but a very solid all around defenseman. Another guy that kind of fits that bill, also a right shot, is Ryan Pulock for the Islanders. His was an 8-year deal, same as Weegar, 8-year deal. They both signed for a little above what we had projected. The difference here with Ryan Pulock is his deal is basically what Severson ended up getting. So Pulock was an 8-year deal, 7.45%. Severson was 8 years, 7.49%. If you look at those two players, they're basically the same player. They're going to give you the same performance. As far as comparables that are a little bit underneath what we thought Severson would get, we're looking at defensemen like Jake Muzzin, Jeff Petrie. Still both very good all-around defensemen. Probably ideal second pair, could be on the first pair, but they're not going to be your number one star defenseman. That's kind of the market basket that we've got for Severson. He isn't your top guy, but he's going to be a very solid number 2 or 3 defenseman.
So you just heard a lot of talking about cap hit percentages instead of average annual value. So for those who might be a little less familiar with how hockey contracts work, average annual value is basically taking the total value of the contract and dividing it by the number of years. And why is that number important? Well, that's the number that counts against the team's salary cap. So when you see teams getting close to that this year, $83.5 million cap, there's really no way for them to restructure contracts like you might see in football. Once they're locked in with that AAV, that average annual value, that's what they're going to count against the cap. So the average annual value basically is what accumulates to the team's overall cap hit. And the NHL has what's called a hard salary cap, meaning, well, tongue in cheek, they're not supposed to exceed the $83.5 million. But there are a few, I'm not even going to say loopholes because I don't think that's fair because it is written into the agreement, the collective bargaining agreement between the players' union and the teams. They're taking advantage of the rules. You saw Vegas put, Mark Stone, for example. He ended up healthy right before the playoffs, ironically, and he was on long-term injured reserve for months. So Vegas was able to use Mark Stone's 9.5 cap hit to add more players at the trade deadline. Then once teams hit the playoffs, so this is probably where there's a little bit more frustration. Once teams hit the playoffs, there is no salary cap that they have to kind of follow. So Vegas was able to add up to another $9.5 million worth of players, and it's even actually more than that because of how the salary cap tolls and everything. That's probably a discussion for a whole nother episode. Yeah, all the rules are the same for everyone. It's just some teams are more willing to exploit them. And it really all comes down to how much their ownership's willing to spend on player salaries. And Vegas has an owner in Bill Foley who's absolutely willing to spend. So getting back a little bit to kind of why we use these cap hit percentages and don't talk quite as much about the AAV, even though it's absolutely important. Well, prior to COVID, the cap was rising a little bit over 4-5% each year. We're going to take out since the COVID pandemic hit, because that's hit revenues and lowered the salary cap. Salary cap's basically tied directly to how much money the NHL makes. There's a split that goes to the owners and a split that goes to the players. The salary cap is set on how much the players are owed in this distribution. So traditionally it rises, and probably starting again next year, we're going to see probably at least a $3 million. Don't put me on the record of that. Maybe even a little bit more $1 million jump. So teams are going to start to have the ability to spend more on players. So it's going to be interesting how this offseason kind of plays out. We saw a couple early deals signed with Gavrikov from the LA Kings signing a 2-year contract, Chicago signing Andreas Athanasiou for a 2-year contract. But then we've also seen those long-term contracts as well. So before we get too far away from Gavrikov here, he was an interesting case. It wouldn't have been surprised if he went maybe just a 1-year contract to walk into this higher cap, but he ended up with a 2-year contract with a really high cap hit percentage that really didn't hit our model.
Yeah, so Gavrikov is one of those, we'll call him a second pair defenseman that should probably get a deal in that 4-5 year range. And he went for 2 years, and it was widely reported that he didn't have any interest in a longer term deal. He wanted 2 years. Exactly why, for sure, we don't know. It seems like it may be of interest to him to be able to hit the open market once again soon, cash in on another deal. So yeah, this was a deal we were a little bit off on. We had Gavrikov signing a 5-year deal with a cap hit percentage of 5.84. That would have been an AV at about 4.88. So I guess we'll call it 4.9 million. What was kind of odd here is, yeah, he went for the shorter deal, and he actually got a much higher AAV here. His cap hit percentage he ended up signing for was 7.04. So, and with Gavrikov going that far over on the AAV, it meant we were quite a bit off here. I think this really speaks to what Kyle was just discussing about how the salary cap so far in the past couple of years, it really hasn't moved too much. It is due to league revenues. The COVID year really messed with some things, and it's taken a little while for the financial landscape for salary cap purposes to recover. There were some rumors it might finally be the year where it fully recovers and we see the bigger jump, 3 mil maybe, in the salary cap, but I don't think that's going to be the case. It seems like it's going to be around 1 million this year, which leads to that idea of maybe players could be looking for a shorter deal to hit the market again, either next year or a couple of years from now when that cap has jumped up way more. We think that's really the situation here with Gavrikov.
So we had Gavrikov and Athanasiou go for just 2-year short-term contracts so they can maybe jump back into the marketplace when teams have more money to spend. But we've also seen teams locking up their young players, namely Cole Caulfield in Montreal and Jesper Bratt in New Jersey, locking them up to long-term contracts that in a year or two we're going to be talking about, oh, that's one of the best value contracts in the sport, because salaries are going to continue to rise as that salary cap rises. And so Jesper Bratt, who's probably a pretty strong first-line player, is going to be locked in for just under $8 million. Then in a year or two, we're going to see other players who are probably more second-line guys start to approach that $8 million contract, just because the salary cap is rising and players are really getting percentages of that, not necessarily a raw AAV or a raw salary number.
Okay, so yes, with with Brat, this was a projection we weren't 100% comfortable with, but there wasn't a whole lot we could do to change what we had. So, on a long term deal, we were looking at 6 years, about 7.25 AAV, and 8.7% cap hit percentage. We did not love this, but we couldn't really edit this projection without straying a bit off the path of how we do our projections. So we rolled with it. When the news came out of his new contract, 8 years, 7.875 AAV, and a cap hit percentage of 9.43, that's nothing that we thought was bad. I mean, that's a great contract for the team. He gets his max term.
Yeah, so it's funny. I texted you about Jesper Braun. Like, I think he's too low. I think he's going to get more. Ran the projection independently myself and came to, the exact same number basically. So there's not much we can do when two of us are looking at it independently and still getting to that same projection. And yeah, Kevin Fiala, perfect comp for him, makes complete sense where that contract came in. It's just our market basket had some guys a little bit higher, a little bit lower, and right around that range. But some of those lower guys brought it down a little bit, and that's fine. We're just gonna live with that, learn from it a little bit more, and I think that's one of the important things to say about our projections is we're continuing to try to learn, but also whatever we've put out at this point, we're not going in and adjusting them. We have one number for years. We have one number for cap hit percentage, and whatever that cap hit percentage is under the current cap, that's what we're going to stick to. And so some people, we've gotten a couple requests already about, extensions for next year. So that's kind of an interesting discussion point because right now the cap's $83.5 million. It'd be absolutely shocking if that wasn't the case going into the offseason at this point with just days to go before free agency is set to open. And then next year, though, project the cap to rise. But whatever that cap's set at is going to really impact how much players are able to sign for next offseason. So us sticking with the cap hit percentage is great. We can come up with a great cap hit percentage for any player eligible for an extension, but it's a little bit difficult thinking about where that cap's going to be next year.
Yeah, so I think when we've looked at extensions, we've used a number of 87.5 for the salary cap. We've gotten this number from Cap Friendly, a super helpful contract site for the NHL. So it isn't just a random number we came up with. Others are using it, estimating it, but it is something we don't know for sure. So sometimes where the cap hit percentage can be hard, especially on extensions, is when you have bigger name players. Without really knowing the exact salary cap for an upcoming season, using the cap hit percentage, it's tough. A player like Austin Matthews, he's got 1 year left. It's pretty much accepted industry-wide that Austin Matthews is going to try to set the market as the top paid player in the National Hockey League. So because of that, we kind of need to keep in mind the AAV. So while we're using comparable players and their contracts and looking at a cap hit percentage, certain situations like this Matthews situation, we want to keep an eye on what does the AAV actually calculate to and make sure we are projecting something that makes sense.
So I think the difference between and some of the things that we do with our projections and kind of how it works in the industry, to give a little bit of insight into how agents and teams negotiate here, is we open our sample of contracts and everything up back until 2012. We've kind of just debated a little bit between us. Is that still the best time frame to use? And maybe over the next couple of years we'll continue to we'll start to move some of those older contracts out because, frankly, there's some players that I'm struggling to remember. And
Basically up on a decade's worth of contracts, and at some point, just the game evolves itself, and people forget literally about certain players, and those contracts just become a little less relevant.
so teams are basically looking, and agents are looking more at the more recent contracts, especially when it comes to the RFAs, the arbitration eligible players. So they're not actually concerned as much about the cap hit percentage. They're still using the average annual value. And I think one of the reasons that we've done really well, and we'll get you kind of the how close we've been the past couple of years with our projections in a second. But I think one of the reasons we did really well is we do have that big sample. We do use that cap hit percentage to drive our value instead of just limiting ourselves to the most recent contracts. So a little plug for ourselves. We've been really close with some of our projections over the past couple of years.
Yeah, so I mean, we really started to have a large amount of projections done in 2019, the off season of 2019, and we were looking at a mean absolute error of about 408,000, which we believe is pretty good for contract projections here.
So to put that in kind of simple terms, we would think that if a player signs a contract, whatever we project them at, kind of add 400 about 400,000 and subtract 400,000, and they should be within that range. If they're not, they're an absolute outlier to what we projected. So even some of these ones that we talked about already and that are going to sign, yeah, we're going to be off, but they're probably going to be within our range of error. So we started at 400,000, and we've gotten, well, COVID was a little bit rough.
Yeah, so the COVID year, I don't want to say we, because I pretty much took over the COVID year with the contract projections, and it was a slight step back, not too far. We had a MAE, so mean absolute error, of 462,000. From there, we ended up not being able to complete contracts in the 2021 off season, but we picked right back up last year, 2022 off season. And this was the best year we've had by far. It was very, very accurate in terms of the MAE. We were at about 348,000. Obviously, the lower the number, the better. And 348 is great. Right now, we're currently sitting at about $413,500 on the MAE for this current 2023 off season. That being said, not a whole lot of contracts in there yet, and some weird ones like Gavrikov. But we fully expect to be in the 300,000s at this point.
Yeah, we want to continue to raise our standard, raise the bar, and we're never going to be perfect. There's always going to be error, but I think that $300,000 range is probably gives viewers of our projections a pretty good kind of understanding of where they're at. So if you want to use our projections, you can find them on Twitter at AFP Analytics. Please also follow us at MaxTermPod on Twitter. And if you have any questions, you can hit us up at either of those places or either of our Twitters. They're linked at the AFP Analytics pinned tweet as well. With that, we would like to thank you for listening to our first episode of the Max Term Podcast, and we'll talk to you next time.